Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Greatest Games podcast on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. Of course, Jonathan Wilson is with us. And also with us in the pod today is Uli Hesse, author, journalist and editor, who's written extensively on German football with books that include Tor, the story of German football, Bayern creating a super club, and Building the Yellow Wall, the incredible rise and cult appeal of Borussia Dortmund. Uli, a pleasure to have you in the pod.
Nice. Hi, I'm honoured to be on the show.
We're honoured to have you. Today we go back to May 1986, the promotion-relegation playoff second leg between Borussia Dortmund and Fortuna Koln that ended 3-1 to Dortmund. Uli, why have you chosen this game?
It was probably the most emotional game I ever saw. I mean, I was at the ground. We're probably going to talk about that. And I was standing right behind the goal where Dortmund scored the deciding goal. We're going to talk about it in a minute anyway. But it was really for... I was 20 years old, so it was just an immensely emotional moment. Again, we're going to talk about why in a moment. And it's also
already the emotions are coming up, I can see.
Yeah, I've done quite a fair amount of interviews after my Dortmund book, and I was often asked about what's the biggest Dortmund game you ever saw, and whenever I say that, which is, I mean, everybody of my age would probably say that, of course it was the Fortuna Koln game, and people who don't know the club very well will always go and say, wow, that's such a, well, they don't say nerdy, but they say, well, that's such a fan's thing to say, It's not the cup win in '89, it's not the Champions League win, but well, my reply is always, well, none of that would have happened, without that terribly hot day in 1986. And I wouldn't have written a book because Dortmund would never have become, such a big club, or that people outside of Germany even would be interested in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a game that I had no idea existed, Jonathan. The history of Borussia Dortmund, I think, starts around 96, 97. That's certainly when it came to my attention. I mean, did you know anything about this?
No, I have to say I didn't.
Match?
And I've now sort of created in my head this very sort of romantic image of German football in the 80s, in that every clip I ever see of the Bundesliga in the 80s, the aesthetic I really like, and I guess just because of the age I was at the time, so that you have a slightly tight shirt, slightly short shorts with kind of blocks of colour. That's when I first started watching football, so it always is going to trigger something in me. The style of football is a style of football that's sort of, again, it's something that I understand on a visceral level rather than an intellectual level. And this is, the drama of this game. But I guess every time I watch clips of German football of the 80s, I'm always watching the important dramatic bits. So it seems like this fantasy land of incredible, exciting finishes every season.
Which is another funny thing about that, Jonathan, is, I mean, I lived through that decade. I was, I think I probably saw every Dortmund home game in that decade, and I hated the 80s. They were god awful.
Well, I mean, something I was really shocked by, and I'm sure we'll get onto the reasons for this more, but I couldn't believe that the average attendance at home for Dortmund that season was just over 20,000.
Yeah, absolutely, which is another reason why I picked the game. I always say, and this is not meant as this is literally the way I remember the 80s is there's a slight drizzle. There is about a very empty south stand. Quite a few of the people standing there are rather unpleasant, and we're losing 1-0 against Waldhof Mannheim. That's the 80s to me. Yeah. Because most people don't know that, but Dortmund were fighting against relegation through most of my early years as a match-going fan. And that was another thing that changed on that day. I did a German oral history book about the club, talking to fans, and very, very many of them say that this was sort of the day that turned things around in terms of, when people think of Dortmund, they think of, it's this tradition-laden club with a fantastic ground, and it's always had this fantastic support. Mm-hmm. And that's true in a way, but the numbers were, like you said, the attendance wasn't very good. It wasn't every game was sold out, but it was after that game when, we're going to talk about that, when it became quite apparent that we could actually lose the club. that things changed, and there was a deciding game, a playoff game, the third game, and a lot of people told me that this was the first time when they got into their car, with the scarves hanging outside of the windows, and they were driving down the motorway, and suddenly they noticed how many Dortmund fans were traveling to that game, which was at a neutral ground. So that was sort of, for them, the starting point of Dortmund having this immense away following.
So, I mean, very, very briefly, can you sort of fill us in on the history? That obviously we know Dortmund had European success in the 60s. So what had happened between them, winning the Cup Winners' Cup and now? No, sorry, I say now, I mean 1986.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of, in the wake of those, big successes in the 60s, which, because I was too young to see that. My brother isn't. My brother is 12 years older than I am. So he was there for all those triumphs. He was actually he founded the first really big Dortmund fan club. And he was, actually, I probably got into the club because, as a kid, I would ask my mum, where is Klaus? Where's my brother? And she would say, I don't know, he's traveling with Borussia Dortmund. That sounded, I don't know. Didn't know what it meant, but it sounded great, He was traveling with, I didn't know that he was traveling in the second division, to, to villages or whatever. So it was a combination of, the classic combination of mismanagement, Dortmund being stuck with an old and not very comfortable ground at the time, the building of the Westfalenstadion. That was another major turning point for the club. And it was also that, Dortmund are based in the Ruhr area, and I don't know, think the north of England, steel and coal, and there was lots of economic crises in the 60s and early 70s. So football in that region generally fell by the wayside. Schalke got relegated.
I mean, Dortmund were relegated in 72, is that right?
Yeah, 72.
And then they came back in 76.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so they've been in the Bundesliga for 10 years, and then this season is a very difficult season.
Yeah, it'd been kind of close a couple of times before, but this year was really, really close.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, looking at the fixtures, looking at the results, there seems to be wildly differing scorelines. I mean, they scored 5 against Uerdingen and Köln, but they conceded 6 against Bochum and Schalke. So it seems that when they were good, they were really good, but they were also capable of being bad.
And they won away at Bayern Munich.
Really?
There was, it's the season as a whole was tremendous. We could also talk about the way how Bayern won the league. When Bremen were just one penalty kick away from winning the league on the penultimate day, and they hit the post and then they lose. It was also sort of, that was the point when most German fans thought, forget about football. I hate this. Bayern Munich are winning every year, but they lost at home to Dortmund during that season, which was it was another strange aspect is that we were coached by Paul Czerny that season.
The Hungarian.
He came in he had quite a big success at Bayern Munich, but he was probably the most un-Dortmund-like coach I've ever seen. He was famous for wearing a silk scarf. He tended to be a little on the arrogant side, having had a reputation as being, tactical mastermind, he was one of the pioneers of zonal marking in Germany and having won all those titles with Bayern. So,
but Uli, when you say that he was a very un-Dortmund-like coach, are you saying that with Dortmund thinking about them in the modern era now, or are you thinking, back then?
No, at the time it was. Right. He was a very sophisticated man, a very cultured man, even coming to a club in the Ruhr area that was, probably fighting relegation, and that was having a crippling debts. That's another backdrop to the whole story.
Yeah,
I mean, I think 2 years before, in late '84, we had more than 8 million marks. More than 8 million marks in the red, which is a terrible sum at the time, huge money. Mm-hmm. And there was always kind of threat that Dortmund would actually have their license revoked. Because in Germany we have the system that, if you're financially unstable, then you're not granted a license for the season, So ahead of every season, you have to open your books and just, explain your finances to the league.
Yeah, they had when I was reading about this, they had an emergency CEO brought in, Dr. Reinhardt. I mean, it showed you that it was quite desperate times for Dortmund at this time.
Oh yeah, I mean, the reason that it was really desperate was that the club just flat out lied, about their finances.
Which seems very un sort of Bundesliga like, but certainly un Dortmund like as well. Because reading about this, it just really clashes with what we know with modern day Dortmund, which is of course the whole point of you choosing this game around that time.
Yeah, but this was long before the big television money.
Mm-hmm.
And Dortmund was a pretty poor city at the time. Mm-hmm. Basically all the clubs from the Ruhr area were struggling financially. Schalke, Duisburg, Bochum.
Would Dortmund have survived if they'd have got relegated? Would the club financially?
That is a good question. That is the thing nobody knows. I mean, a couple of players were already leaving. We knew. Yes, I think it was already. I mean, the goalkeeper Eike Immel, a Germany goalkeeper. He was in talks with Stuttgart, and he later left. We knew that the guy who eventually scored the deciding goal,
the hero,
the hero, that he would play for Schalke next season, and nobody, the feeling was not that he's a traitor or anything. I think most people felt, hey, we're getting 1.5 million marks for him. That's good. We need him.
He tells it a different way, though.
He does, yeah.
He says that the fans were booing him and it spurred him on and so on, but of course that's maybe looking at it with rose-tinted spectacles. Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable, Jonathan, just hearing about Dortmund, because I know clubs have histories, and obviously, you think about an obvious one, say Manchester City, how differently their history's been, and you don't even have to go back that far. But for a club that were kind of on the brink, like Dortmund, that is quite weird to think.
Well, it's weird that it then happened again. The fact it happened, 20 years ago as well. The fact they've twice come that close. But I don't know, the more I sort of look back at the 80s, the more you sort of realise that although everything's the same, it's also incredibly different. And I think, attendances are something that's really hard to process to us now. I remember going to Sunderland games. If you got 16,000, it felt like it was absolutely packed. This was a massive crowd. And if you ever touched 20, that was incredible. And now, if it dips below 30, even though we're playing two divisions lower, you sort of say, what's gone wrong? So, I mean, I don't know. The lower crowds across England in the 80s were, I guess, a facet of the economic reality that a lot of people just didn't have money, but also the fact that grounds were pretty unpleasant places, both architecturally, the facilities weren't good, and also the threat of violence. So was that similar in Germany, Uli? Was it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe people have this impression of Dortmund as always being so well supported because of the ground. When it was built in '74, I don't know if you know this story about the ground. Anyway, but it was built only because of the World Cup. Dortmund weren't supposed to be a host city. Cologne were, and then Cologne, opted out just on very short notice. So Dortmund were told to go ahead and build a ground for the World Cup, and there was no money. The city was as poor as the club, so they built a ground that didn't really follow the rules for the World Cup. There was very few seated areas. There was no running track, nothing. But then, this English-style ground, that would prove, number one, very attractive. So people just loved it. And it was also during the 80s, as you said about Sunderland, it always looked full, Even if we had only 20 or 25,000, it was okay, It looked like a decent crowd, really good. Whereas, most other clubs had these huge grounds, the Olympic Stadium in Munich was a total nightmare. It's as you said, for this book about, this oral history book about Dortmund, we of course we asked everybody about photos. Do you have photos? And some of those strips from the 80s to the Olympic Stadium, you would think a photo was taken like 5 hours before kickoff. And then you look at it and you realize people are playing on the pitch, It's just empty. It's 10,000 in this huge ground. It looks very empty.
So you mentioned earlier the south stand. So
yeah,
which end is that when the camera that's the main camera when we're looking at this game? Which one is the south stand?
Oh God, this is a tricky question now because I think these days it's on the right end because it was switched around.
Okay. Was the goal the end where the goals were scored? Which end was that?
In 86.
In 86, yeah.
That was the south stand.
Okay.
The problem, the confusing thing is that, when you look at the ground today, and when you can see, today it's the left side. Sorry. Okay.
It's tricky.
Yeah, it's because this is a very, very good question from Jonathan because you get so used to you're watching football on television that you have this idea of a ground. So what they did in Dortmund was the press stand, the entire press stand, moved from one stand to the other. At some point, I think it was some point during the 90s, probably when they, when the ground was rebuilt.
Yeah, and the reason I'm asking is that the end where the goals are scored, it looks absolutely amazing. It's completely yellow. The atmosphere looks brilliant in there. And it instinctively because obviously watching Dortmund now, it's at the wrong end. If you see what I mean. So I was wondering whether it had switched around, and you just answered that it has switched around.
All you have to do is look at the benches.
Right. Okay.
In the old days they would be opposite. I mean, on television you could look at the two coaches.
Yeah.
At the two benches, the substitute benches. These days you don't, because the cameras are above the two benches.
So did the south stand have the same reputation then as the yellow wall has now?
Yes, it did. It was one of the. It was not as big as it is today, of course, because they added a second tier to every stand during the 90s. But it was a famous status.
And did Dortmund have the same sort of reputation for having this great support then, or is that a more recent development?
Yeah, as I said, this whole thing about having this tremendous away support, that kind of grew after 1986. That people started really following the club in large numbers, But the south stand was almost always sold out. Like I said, I can remember days when you could quite freely walk around on the south stand, and then run into people, running into undesirables in the 1980s. But it was always the central, the fan stand. The funny thing is, I don't know if any of you has ever been to Dortmund. Which is one thing you should do, really. I'm not saying this because it's my club, but because of so many clubs are building new grounds now and putting them, outside the city limits or whatever. And Dortmund is really, really very interesting because, number one, you can walk from the city centre.
That's lovely when you
to
can
the
do
ground.
That. Yeah.
And the other thing is that right next to the new ground is the old ground. It's where they used to play until 1974 and where they played all those games in the European Cup in the 60s. And it looks almost exactly like it did in the 60s. And it looks almost exactly the way it looked when my brother first went to a game in the 60s. So you've got these two grounds right next to each other. The old one is still used for the reserves and for track and field and things like that. And, And in the old ground, the home support would stand on the north stand, where it was a curve actually. They would be in the north. So now they're building this new ground right next to the old one, and it opens a couple of months before the '74 World Cup, and suddenly people are on the south stand, and everybody I talked to confirmed this. You can also watch it, you can see the footage. The game opens. The stadium opens with a game friendly against Schalke, and from the first day on, the Dortmund fans are on the south stand, which is strange because the north and the south were exactly alike. One of the reasons the ground was so cheaply built was there was sort of, it was, I don't know how you call this, but it was an identical ground. Everything was almost the same. And it's when you walk from the city centre to the ground, you naturally walk towards the north stand. So that it would be normal for the home support to be there. Actually, it always causes a lot of friction for big games, especially for derbies. That it's the other way around. The Schalke fans have to be escorted to the north stand, there's a far wide open space right in front of the stand and everything like that. So we asked around. We asked people, why did you go to the south stand? And nobody knew it. They all said, oh, that's a good question. It's a really good question. I never thought about it. I have no idea, really. We just found one guy who had a theory. And he said that Dortmund's biggest rivals are Schalke. They, too, built a ground for the World Cup in '74. Their ground opened a couple of months before Dortmund's ground. And they went to the north stand. The Schalke fans did. So his theory was that the Dortmund fans said, okay, if those guys are standing in the north, we're going to stand in the south.
Yeah. It only takes one bloke to change it, doesn't it? Everyone match that's and there suddenly history's changed forever.
I know.
Right.
It was probably a very boring German technicality.
Yeah.
Probably just a ticket allocation or whatever.
Yeah. It would have been a sensible decision, Uli. We can agree on that. All right, chaps, let's have a quick break, and then we'll talk about the match, or matches, I should say, themselves. Welcome back to the greatest games on the Blizzard, everybody. Right then, so Dortmund, they had a bad season. They finished in the Bundesliga. They were third from bottom, which meant that they had to play the kind of relegation promotion playoff against the team who'd finished third in the second tier in Germany, which was of course Fortuna Koln. I mean, for all the reasons we've spoken about earlier, the financial reasons and whatnot, as a Dortmund fan, this must have been the last thing pretty much the last thing other than being, relegated automatically that the club needed. They needed to stay in the top flight.
Oh, absolutely. It was. I mean, when you look at the final table, I think it was only 2 goals. We were just 2 goals away from safety.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Eintracht
Frankfurt.
Yeah, but the way I remember it was never really that close. I think Frankfurt lost on the last day, but they conceded the goal very late. Mm-hmm. So it was never. We were quite early. We thought that 16th place. That's the relegation spot. I mean, what in German is called the relegation spot, which is not the relegation spot.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's actually, we called it the relegation. The games between those playoffs are called the relegation in Germany. I don't know why. And a lot of people have criticized the system, still do. It was introduced in 1982, to not have an English-styled playoff system, with teams in the same division, but, having Bundesliga clubs play against the team from the second division.
The team from the second division rarely wins, if I understand correctly.
These days it almost never does.
Yeah.
Which is one of the major criticisms. The system was stopped. I think it was introduced in '82. We stopped about 9 or 10 years later, and it was reintroduced about 10 or 11 years ago. And ever since, there's a debate about it. Number one is, of course, that people find it slightly unfair, that a team from the Bundesliga gets another shot, at surviving, whereas a team from the second division is denied. You play a really good season and you end up with nothing. Then a lot of people say, and there's some truth to it, it's really nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
Especially for the Bundesliga team, One team is really facing, it's not like in England. If you lose, that's okay. You still stay in the same division you've been in.
Well, except when they were introduced in England, it was the 3rd to 5th teams in the division below and the 3rd bottom team from the division above. Okay. So in 1987, when Sunderland were relegated to the 3rd division for the first time, they were relegated in a playoff. They played Gillingham in the semi-final. They lost 3-2 down at Priestfield, went back to Roker, won 3-2, went to extra time, and they won 4-3 and were relegated on away goals, which is what, and away goals don't even count in the playoffs now in England. Yeah. So I think Sunderland are the only team ever to have been relegated on away goals. Tony Cascarino scored a hat trick But don't get me started on private grief.
No, it's interesting because we have to talk about this because it was, it's not only that we were lucky that the system was in place. It's at that time I think there had been 4 playoffs and the team from the second Bundesliga had won twice, so we weren't. It was still quite. We didn't consider ourselves overwhelming favourites, but we thought, God, we're the Bundesliga team. I mean, let's be honest about it. Who are Fortuna Koln? So
and they'd had a very poor end to the season. So with 6 games to go, they had a game in hand, but with 6 match days left, they were top of the table. They then took 1 point from 5 games. They beat Bayreuth 6-0. Then on the final day, they were 2-0 down against Karlsruhe, got it back to draw 2-2, and still only finished third to get in the playoff because Kassel lost to Bayreuth. So
you know more about it than I do.
Right, because I've done a modicum of research this morning. So, I mean, presumably Fortuna Koln was sort of thinking, we shouldn't even be in this. We should have got the automatic promotion.
Yeah. Probably, yeah.
Well,
and it was also, sorry, just because Jonathan mentioned that.
Of course, yeah.
And the away goals didn't count.
Yes.
Which would turn out to be very, very important. I think it's just because, one other thing about this whole relegation promotion playoff is that so much is on the line, even more so today, of course. And it could all come down to an away goal, or as it sometimes did later, a penalty shootout, People find that very, very unfair. And maybe, I don't really know, but maybe that is why when it was first introduced, the lawmakers said we're not going to have the away goals rule, So if teams are level on, points and goals, then it go to a
well, Sunderland have also failed in the playoffs with an own goal, and twice they've lost on penalties. So
the whole lot.
We've had our playoff hell.
Yeah.
I mean, things like that, they probably sound like a good idea, when somebody brings it up. And then, I was at the game when Liverpool won the UEFA Cup against Alaves, and you watch it and the game ends on an own goal.
Yeah. The golden goal, yeah.
And you think, this is not right.
Yeah.
No.
This is somehow not right. And,
The powers that be like to tinker with the rules and structure of football. This season, no exception, of course. Although we're sort of trying to keep that at arm's length. But going back to the playoff games, Fortuna Koln, they host the first one against Dortmund. Big attendance, 44,000 there, and they win 2-0.
Yeah,
it's a strong start.
The game, Another thing about this relegation playoff is that a couple of years earlier, I think it was 4 years earlier, we played Fortuna Koln in a cup semi-final, which was a really, really big thing for Dortmund to reach a cup semi-final. And, we traveled to a second division club. And I remember that on the way, on the motorway in the car, we were all talking about the cup final, Gosh, Dortmund have never been in a cup final as far as I know, for us, as kids. And then we can actually win something. Imagine that, And then we go out and we get hammered 5-1 by the second division team, And now 4 years later, there's a chance, we've got the chance for revenge, So I remember I was fairly optimistic because I thought we were the Bundesliga team. We had Germany goalkeeper, Ike Emel was, I think there was always, there was a problem for him because the national team were traveling to Mexico, had to travel to Mexico without him because he was playing the promotion relegation games,
Well, it shows you.
And then Fortuna Cologne, they moved the game from their own ground to Cologne FC's ground, to a bigger ground, to get more people in, to get more money in. And I thought this seems like, what a dumb idea, I thought they should stay at their own ground, where they beat us 5-1. Now they moved to their rival's ground. And I felt it was sort of like, an admission that they were the underdogs, sort of like in the cup game, where you would think, we're probably going to get knocked out, but let's make as much money out of this as we can.
Mm-hmm. So was it then doubly surprising that they won the first leg?
For some reason, I don't know why, I wasn't at the game.
Mm-hmm.
My brother went. And he came back and he said, we're getting relegated. There's no doubt we're getting relegated. We're awful. They beat us 2-0, could have been 3-0. Forget about it. So that's when I first thought, oh God, this relegation promotion thing is, not going to be as easy as I thought.
It's the semi-final all over again.
Yeah.
Well, the second leg, which is of course the main game in question today, was at the Westfalenstadion. Dortmund didn't move that. Why would they? And where on earth would they move it to? Perhaps the old stadium. But it was a big attendance in there. And as you said, really, this is when maybe the people of Dortmund came out to support their team. But I mean, it's a big attendance. And going into the game, having lost the first leg 2-0, people couldn't have been that confident, especially, going on what your brother said as well.
To be honest, I don't really remember how. Maybe we thought, 2 goals, that's possible, because as I said, the away goals rule was not in effect, So we knew we had to win by 2 goals to get to playoff. I can't really remember. What I do remember very clearly is that with 10 minutes, with barely 10 minutes gone, I was thinking, my brother's right, we're getting relegated. It was because the Dortmund were really, really nervous. I remember that. I do have I mean, the footage of the game is not in wide circulation. For many, many years, you couldn't get anything because it was on a private station. The game was shown on a private station at the time.
Yeah. I have seen the goals, and I have to say the opening goal was a lovely one from
the playmaker Grabosch.
Who scored, of course, in the second one. But you're right. It's
that was
not easy to find.
That was even before the goal. I mean, even before the goal, the opening stages, which is Dortmund were very, very, very nervous. And from that point on, it got worse with every minute. And then, as you said, they took a lead. I mean, what I was going to say is that sometimes you watch a game, and then you go back and watch it on television, and it's a totally different game. And it took me really years to find that. And actually, I think I paid money for it on eBay.
Right.
Somebody who taped that on videotape, and not many people had video recorders in the mid '80s. So, and I watched the game, and it was pretty much the way I remembered it. So very, very nervous beginning. Dortmund lost, were constantly losing possession, and the players were really, really nervous. And that's, that's when an uneasy feeling is creeping in, when you realize that your guys are really nervous.
Yeah.
That's when you think, oh God, this could be a close one.
Yeah, they went 1-0 down after 14 minutes to a goal from.
Yeah, as you said, lovely goal. I mean, I think he was surrounded by 4 or 5 players.
Well, he scored a lovely goal in the first leg, which actually was the one I think I was thinking of when I said that earlier. It was jinked in between the defenders, and then but that was still a nice one in the second.
Well, it was just a very precise finish from just outside the box, wasn't it? Just sort of hit it low, left-footed into the bottom corner.
And one thing, which I don't know if you've not seen it, if you've only seen the goals, I don't know what kind of footage you've seen. It was years later somebody told me, and that's one of the things where you think, wait a minute, this really happened. And many years later, somebody told me that, just a couple of minutes later, it could have been 2-0. And I said, yeah. He said, yeah. He said, Jörg Neun, the winger who later played for Gladbach, he was 1-on-1 with our goalkeeper. And I couldn't really remember that. And then finally, which was one of the reasons why I bid money for the DVDs, and then looked at it. And it wasn't. I think it was after half an hour. He was 1-on-1 with Ike Immel, but not in the central position. He had a tight angle, but people do score from that angle. So, and 2-0, that it would have been over at 2-0.
Yeah, I mean, from the little you can find about the game and sort of reports and all that kind of stuff, it seemed to be just get till half time for Dortmund. I mean, because as you say, 2-0 down at half time, maybe there's no way back, but they got in at half time.
Yeah, it was also
1-0 down.
Sorry, it was also the feeling about half time was also because not just for the general things and not regroup and the manager was no longer Paul Scherner at that point.
Yeah.
He'd been fired and replaced by his assistant. It was also because because Jonathan mentioned that, well, you have these silly things, but I think a lot of people on the stand thought, in the second half, they're going to attack this goal here.
Yeah.
And which is one of the things, every Dortmund captain learns, when he's given the armband, that, if you win the toss, second half, we attack the goal in the south. So with our fans behind that goal. And I think a lot of people thought that somehow we're going to suck this ball in, somehow.
Yeah, that's the term, isn't it? You hear that about sort of the Liverpool players, about the Kop, famously. So he's just sort of sucking that ball into the goal, and that seemed to be the idea. And I suppose Jonathan as well. With the scorelines the way it was like, lads, we have to attack.
There's nothing
now.
to lose, is there? It's going to there's no sort of being careful about it. It's just we have to score 3 goals, and so Anderbrugge comes on at half time. The footage I've seen, it's about 20 minutes you can find on YouTube now, which shows sort of all of the last 10 minutes, which is astonishing.
That's probably the key. That's probably the game in a nutshell.
Yeah, but the point I was making was it's very hard to sort of make any tactical kind of conclusions from what changed. But yeah, Anderbrugge came on for Huber. So, left winger for left back? Is that right?
Yeah, Huber was the right back normally.
Okay.
But what I was going to say is, yes, so it's half time, and yes, as you said, we have to attack. We have to score 3 goals, and now we're attacking, the south stand, the goal in front of the south stand. But the way I remember it, it's not as if the second half begins, and we have one scoring chance after the other. It took a really, really long time, and the equalizer was. It came from a penalty.
Yeah, it was It was a soft. Well, you
well,
said the equaliser.
It's a foul. It's just a completely needless foul.
Yeah.
So Anderbrugge is sort of going across the corner of the box, and he's just sort of it's Gede sort of just bundles him over. But he could have, if he'd waited half a second, Anderbrugge would have been outside the box. He wasn't going towards goal. There was no need to make the challenge when he did. So I think it was a penalty. It was just totally pointless one to give away.
Yeah. And it was just, just barely inside the box,
Yeah, well, yeah, he was in that corner of the box for just as he went across that little triangle, that angle. That's when the contact happened.
Which is it's so negligent. I mean, and it was on 54 minutes. So there's still a bit of time.
Yeah, and then you think, God, this is the break we needed.
Yeah.
A kind of, well, not soft, but, a kind of dumb penalty.
Yeah, exactly.
And Michael Zorc scores it, who, of course, now is the sporting director and the record appearance maker and everything, so...
Yeah. Well, back then the penalty was a goal for Dortmund.
Right, yeah.
Because Zorc was just one of the greatest penalty takers I've ever seen. And the way, the way he buried that, he was still fairly young and God, I don't even want to think about the pressure he must have been under,
Oh, man. Yeah. He didn't show it, though, did he?
Yeah. And then just I don't know, 10 or 12 minutes later, we'll make it 2-1. Mm-hmm. And one of the... Well, if you're not so familiar with Dortmund, before they became Dortmund, it was... the second goal was a header from our playmaker. It was probably the first and the last headed goal he ever scored.
Really, because it's a really good header. It's a lovely one.
Yeah, but he's just barely taller than a corner flag.
But it's a really nice goal. So Simmers, the centre forward, sort of breaks down the right side into the box, sort of chops back, and it's one of those nice crosses where he's clearly sort of placed the cross. He's not, I don't know, he's 15 yards from Raducanu, and sort of places it on his head, and it's just, he looks like it's a proper sort of Tommy Lawton style header. Yeah, is how it appears. He sort of cranes for it, and he's got the sort of full neck muscles, the little bit of a sort of 80s sort of demi mullet, so the hair's just sort of flicking, and he guides it into the top corner. It's a lovely goal. Yeah,
but in fact, he was rather I don't know, Glenn Hoddle or whoever. I mean, he was a Romanian international who deserted his country. They had Romania played a friendly in Dortmund, And just after the game, he vanished. Actually, he faked an injury, so he could get into the dressing room and then ran away. And that's how he ended up in Dortmund. And he was a fantastic playmaker, very cultured midfielder. And for most of my childhood, it was, when I was watching Dortmund, there was one footballer and, 10 guys trying to figure out what he was going to do, So he was always, well, not always, but he was way better than most everybody else. And at times, I even pitied him a bit, I thought he could play for a much bigger team than Dortmund. But he was so good. But now he was getting old. He would play only 1 or 2 more seasons for Dortmund. And then he scores a header. He'd never done that before, at least not that I can remember. So then it's still almost half an hour. And you think, now we're going to roll over these guys, This is, now we're going to... And we don't, It was just, the game dragged on and on. And it's only those last, 15, 18, 19 minutes when really the chances started coming.
But the chances, it is chance after chance after chance after chance. It's an extraordinary sort of 10 minutes, 12 minutes on that video where you realise you're watching it pretty much as live, and there's the little yellow clock, and it seems to go up so slowly because there's just a chance every sort of 30 seconds. And the keeper ends up sort of being semi-responsible for the third goal, Jurečky, but he makes 2 absolutely unbelievable saves.
Yeah.
So there's I think it's Anderbrugge. I couldn't quite see on the video with a volley sort of at the back post, and it's a very sort of 80s save. It's the kind of save you never see keepers make these days.
What is an 80s save?
I don't know. It's just a kind of save that doesn't happen these days.
I sort of know what you mean.
I think maybe it's because he's dressed in an 80s way, so he's got that sort of the pale top, the tracksuit bottoms, and tracksuit bottoms was such a German thing for goalkeeper from the point of view of an English kid. Yeah, they had that sort of glamour. But
when I think of an 80s save, I think of goalkeepers blocking balls with their feet. Nobody does that anymore.
That's a 90s save. An 80s save is somebody hitting a ball really hard and the keeper being maybe 6 or 8 yards away and somehow getting a hand to it and flicking it over the bar. I can't say that Arcanada made all the time, and this is one of them. You just never see saves like that. I don't know if it's because his positioning's wrong or something, but so leaning back, hand goes up, flicks it over the bar. It's a brilliant save. And then the save from the header. And again, I got absolutely no idea whose header it was. Simmers maybe from a position where he just sort of spreads himself and the ball bounces away off his thigh from close range. And presumably, Dortmund are starting to think this just isn't going to go in.
Yeah, what I remember most clearly are the corners. I've never seen stats from the game. But as far as I'm concerned, the last 10 minutes was just one corner after the other, totally incredible. And there was also, I also remember vividly thinking that I think after 75 minutes, they were just totally knackered, Cologne, they were really, really good for large parts of the game. For a second division side, they could really play. But at one point, they just stopped playing, they were just belting the balls away. And of course, they came back rather quickly, and we won another corner. I think 5 minutes from time, Wickman hit the crossbar. I can remember that.
Yeah.
The ball goes out. It's another corner, and literally seconds later, 5, 6, 7 seconds later, Michael Zorc has a glorious chance.
Blazes it miles over.
Yeah. Blazes over the bar.
But actually, just before the volley hits the bar, there's a move that's very similar to the goal, where I think it's Anderbrugge cuts in down the left, gets sort of, he's 3 or 4 yards from the line, drives it across, and Jurečky pushes it out. And this time, the substitute, Karl-Heinz Wirtz, who, if I understood the commentary correctly, was an amateur player. Is that possible?
Yeah, could be. What we refer to amateur players is normally the reserves.
Okay.
At the time, the second team is nominally called the amateurs.
Right. Okay.
So it was a reserve team player.
Yeah, and he sort of just gets there first, is able to clear it.
Do you remember what sort of commentary you had? Or what you were watching on YouTube? Because
it was a German commentary. I've got no idea. All I can say to try and narrow it down is at the end of the first half and the end of the second half, it cut immediately to a guy on the touchline in a jacket very similar to one Julian Nagelsmann wore against Manchester United. And he was straight away doing interviews. He interviews Grabosch at the end of the first half. He interviews Immel and a couple of others at the end of the second half.
Yeah, so that's probably the original footage from set one.
Yeah, he's got sort of a big forehead and a sort of a little moustache. Yeah. He's sort of starting to recede. Bit of a Sven-Göran Eriksson hairstyle. Calm down, Marcus.
Because three things now add to the drama of it all. One is, of course, something I witnessed, and I opened my book about Dortmund with this game, with the last minute, and because with Lars Ricken, who 11 years later would score the winning goal in a Champions League final, and he, as a young boy, is standing behind the goal. And I was talking to him about, we were sort of comparing our, memories of the game, and he could remember what I could remember, which was that at some point it looked as if people had left on the south stand because there were sort of gaps, And you think, why would anybody leave the ground, with like Dortmund just needing one more goal? And it turned out they hadn't left. People had sat down. People were not able to watch any longer. And I very vividly remember that a guy was sitting down in front of me, and he had his flag over his head, and he was sobbing. You could see his shoulders heaving. And he never saw the goal, of course. And many people never saw the goal. So that was the thing I saw. Then there was something somebody told me later, which was that there was German on regional German television, West German television. There was a news show at the time, and they at the end of the show they announced that Dortmund had been relegated from the Bundesliga. They said Dortmund Fortuna Koln 2-1, and we're sorry to report that Dortmund have been relegated from the Bundesliga. But Cologne are a Western club as well, from the West Germany, from the western part of Germany, and so on and so on. And the third thing is this television footage, which I only learned about years later, because, as I said, I bid for the DVDs, and it was shown on private television, and there were two co-commentators, two pundits, and the guy who commented on the game, he introduced one pundit as saying, "We have with us former international Rolf Rüssmann, who used to play for Dortmund, so he's probably going to support Dortmund today. And our other pundit, he's going to be more neutral because he's Detmar Kramer, famous German coach who won the European Cup with Bayern." And at that point, Detmar Kramer said, "Well, I was born in Dortmund." So he's sitting there with two pundits by his side who want Dortmund to win. And then, when you remember that, the final move of the game starts with Dortmund at their own goal. Ike Immel has the ball. And at that point, the commentator starts welcoming Fortuna Cologne to the Bundesliga. He said, "This is now the final move of the game, and now we'll welcome Fortuna Cologne. They will be like, I don't know, the other teams will promote that season. Blau-Weiß Nancy or whatever." And then, while he's talking, you can hear Rolf Rüssmann getting agitated, beside him. And it's two pundits who yell when the ball goes in, They realize that before the commentator, because he's doing. So
the goal is Bunch Stork, the centre back, who of course goes on to manage Hungary. So we saw him at the Euros back in 2016. He crosses it, and then Stork and Simmers both flick it on. Comes to Anderbrugge at the back of the box. He drives it across goal.
And he's not, Anderbrugge is not. He's just knocking. He's not looking up. He's not looking.
Yeah, he's driving into the 6-yard box. Yeah,
it's normally you would pull that ball back.
Yeah,
maybe towards the penalty spot or whatever.
And then what I love about it is, in this mayhem at the end of this sort of incredibly protracted siege, Uretsky can't quite hold it. The ball spills loose, and it's the most apologetic finish. That the Wegeman's gone slightly beyond the ball. He has to just sort of drag it from behind him with his left foot, and it's a very gentle contact. If it's enough,
and there's this moment where he's hesitating.
Yeah, and he looks completely overwhelmed by it
from the south stand and thinking, "What's he doing?"
Yeah,
yeah.
And I guess he's just making sure he gets a proper contact on the ball. He's not under any pressure. There's no defenders there, And he must have a sort of realisation of, if I get any forward movement on this is in, because he's 2 yards from goal, from the line. Mm-hmm. And then he sort of seems almost overwhelmed by what he's done. And you see everybody going berserk in the stands, and you see the other players going berserk. And it takes him a little while to sort of join the celebrations. It's as if he's, the realisation of the enormousness of what he's done has slightly kind of knocked him over.
I mean, that was when that goal goes in early. Dortmund, you're watching the celebrations. I mean, and it's understandable they've come back from the dead, but you would almost think it was a winning goal rather than an equalising goal.
Which is another thing that Jonathan just mentioned. This guy on the sideline, with the I think he's wearing a heavy tape recorder, and I don't know. No, that footage is probably not on YouTube, but he's trying to talk to people, and to the players and everybody, and you can sense there's a pitch invasion going on, very slowly. It's not the sort of thing, where, I don't know, final whistle and everybody storms the pitch. It starts very slowly, but suddenly more and more people, are invading the pitch, and finally he gets to talk to the president, whom you mentioned, Reinhard Raubal, and they're doing the interview, and then right in the middle of the interview, Raubal is being carried away. People lifting him up, just carrying him away. And it's like I said, it's as if they'd won the game. Well, technically they've won the game, of course.
Sure.
But it was just, they just lived, scored a goal to live another day. But I think everybody at the ground felt that, this is it.
And then there's supposed to be the third game, I think 4 days later. And Fortuna Koln managed to get it delayed by a week. They claim they'd gone down with food poisoning or a stomach virus or something. But the suspicion seems to be they were just trying to kind of let some of that euphoria ebb away.
Yeah, I mean, they must have been really, really, they must have been devastated. Another, you just mentioned everybody going, the way I remember it, of course it's total nonsense, but the way I remember it, the ball crosses the line and there's a moment of total silence. It's really the way I remember it, that nobody's celebrating, total silence. The only thing I remember is that all the Fortuna Koln players, fell to the ground. That's sort of the image I have of the next couple of seconds. Maybe it's probably just fractions of a second, but it just, have that image of, 11 Cologne players lying on the ground. And it's almost, I don't know, I think, I don't know if it was a ruse, or maybe they really had it.
Yeah, but anyway, it didn't help because a week later...
I was about to say.
they played the game in Dusseldorf and it finishes 8-0.
Yeah,
so what was the problem?
Yeah, but...
Incredible.
But the first goal, it came only after half an hour. When you look at the scoreline, it's Cologne 0, Dortmund 8. But it was scoreless for half an hour.
And it was only 1-0 at half time.
Yeah, and it was only right before, I think, right at the start of the second half, we scored 2 or 3 goals, and they just collapsed. And the funny thing about that is, the first game, I couldn't go, but my brother went. And I forgot why. No, it can't have been the army. I don't know, he was 22. Anyway, he didn't go to the deciding, he had a ticket and couldn't go to the game, to the deciding third game, which was played in Düsseldorf. So I went with my brother-in-law, who's not the biggest of football fans. If anything, he supports Bayern Munich. And I was so relieved after that game, And I remember sitting in the car with him, and it was totally, even though it was 8-0, I was totally nerve-wracked. And suddenly he goes, well, that was kind of boring, wasn't it?
Oh dear. Well, yeah, 8-0, easy peasy, and Dortmund stayed up, and that was the first step towards their sort of modern history. You certainly suggested early.
Yeah, so many things. It was only I didn't know this at the time, or maybe I probably did, but we needed of course we needed a replacement, for Jürgen Wegmann, who signed for Schalke. And what I didn't know was that we signed Frank Mill, and who would turn out to be a very, very important striker for Dortmund. One of the key players when they won the cup 3 years later. And he was sitting in the stands. You can see him, So he was sitting in the stands watching the game. I wonder what he was thinking.
Yeah, he's thinking, give me half a chance and I'll improve this lot. Well, Uli, we have to finish there, but it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this. And a very, very important and perhaps largely unknown piece of Dortmund's history to certainly fans in Britain. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been great. Thank you, Uli.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks a lot. And now I have to go back and find those DVDs.
Yeah,
They've got to be somewhere.
Well, for more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk. But thank you very much for listening, everybody. Thank you, Jonathan, of course. We'll see you next week.